No, great to share with Capacity for Development a few thoughts on what is indeed a very interesting evaluation we're receiving, not just on the last 7 years of EU development aid, overall 2.5 billion spent in Palestine, but even taking sort of a 20-year look, 20 years after the Oslo Accord actually gave the framework ahead of which the international community was hoping that there indeed would be a peace settlement with Israel, that this would require the setting up of a viable Palestinian authority living in a contiguous side-by-side solution with Israel. Now, the evaluation is very clear that this has not happened. The evaluation is also clear in giving us credit for having done the maximum sort of to stabilize both fiscally, economically the Palestinian Authority, and also to do the maximum of some minimum capacity building and statehood building. But the evaluation is also very clear, and the presenter used the analogy of the football match. I mean, you can train a soccer team ad nauseum, but if they never play the game, it's very difficult to see how they actually react. And this is where the evaluation now comes in, looking less ex post, but more ex ante, and saying that if we were serious with our objectives, with more and more European Council conclusions backing up the need for a two-state solutions, and also for Israel to have less suffocating policies, the so-called imposed constraints. We read a lot in the evaluation about the economic impact, the negative economic impact on the restrictions on freedom of movement and access, on the access to land, access to water. It is very difficult to see how that current policy of just continuing the status quo would indeed merit that effort. And they come to the recommendation that one should bring in Israel more directly, sort of get out only of seeing EU-Israel bilaterally, EU-Palestine bilaterally, but arguing that this should be brought into a triangular relationship where also Israel understands some of the objectives, shares some of the objectives behind the funding we are providing, but also shares some of the responsibility of putting policies into place which would make them more viable. We got an interesting question from one of the member states who said, did this evaluation also look in detail what they were doing? No, the evaluation does not, but this allowed us to make the point that as we develop joint programming further, of course, we would more and more also get into joint evaluations with member states, allowing not just to look at what Commission funding did, but in tandem also what one of the member states delivered. So also good prospect. An even better prospect than maybe in some of the other countries, given the need, as we see, to leverage more forcefully and leverage more politically the way we operate. Yes, fair point, and that makes the evaluation so interesting, and it's candid. And saying that the objectives, namely to which we had 20 years ago, are far from being reached. I mean, there's no imminent process of a fully independent Palestinian state, nor is a fully prospect there of a viable economic settlement. It's still occupied territories with all the restrictions. And this is where it argues that if we were serious with also our long-term objectives, it's a good moment to make sure that we bring in the Israelis in that discussion, also as development actors and not just as a political actor. But once again, it's an important. I think one of the evaluations will stay there as a reference point on what they can achieve. And the challenge for us is to make sure that this is not just an afterthought, looking after the last 10 years, but that we really take this as a starting base for the identification of our next multi-annual programs and annual programs with Palestine.